Whenever you're ready to start, bavakasha.
Okay, I'm watching. I'm watching the time. Let's go. So first, thank you for joining us again. I have to tell you how much I've enjoyed our conversation, the material that's being presented, and certainly the feedback from some of you, and participation. I think is a key for that. Let me begin by just reviewing very quickly some of the key points of the last two sessions, and then we'll move forward into new material. We began with an overview of Halacha, which was created by the Tanaim, and I should add by earlier Tanaim, by those who came early in the Tanaitic period. Certainly before Churban Habayit, who created Halacha b'bnei Tikkun Olam. And as that's been understood through the texts, it was with an intent to address broad societal problems, the problems of aguna, the problems of mamzera through the generations, problems that women might choose not to marry without sufficient financial incentive, or if they have sufficient financial disincentive. The lack of loans for aniyim, when loans were to be forgiven during the Shmid year, and people were reluctant then to make them. All of these are broad societal issues, which Chazal, certainly in the early Tanaitic period, understood that by creating rabbinic halacha or adjusting earlier rabbinic halacha, they might have the power and certainly the authority to ameliorate, to address. That was Mipnei Tikkun Olam. Sometimes they succeeded and sometimes they didn't. We saw instances in which when they didn't succeed, they tried again. But that was an early attempt to create a vision of society which is based on harmony, which is based on shalom, and which actively addresses societal problems as they're identified. It's an interesting approach to creating halacha. We also saw that, in fact, later Chazal, in discussing these earlier actions, were very important to stress that the Tanaim were only dealing with halacha d'Rabbanan. That in fact they would not have given themselves permission, seen themselves as having permission to address a d'oraita halacha that is identified as coming from Torah, or for halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that is whether it's clearly in the Torah or only by tradition, as understood as coming from the written Torah. That they would not have had permission to adjust that halacha, only to adjust and to address halacha that was of their making. Mipnei Tikkun Olam. Later, I think, beginning with last week, we began to look at halacha that the Tanaim created mipnei dachei shalom, for the sake of the paths of peace, understanding that all of Torah is intended to bring harmony in human society. In the examples that we looked, which I believe are in fact exemplative, that is, they are consistent with the way this approach was used, focus on situations, identified particular situations within human relations that might have led to the lack of harmony, and attempted to correct them. And so, for instance, the question of who gets honored in a shul, who gets the honors in a shul first, rather than having people argue over it, each one believing that they deserve the honor as much as or more than their fellow, an order was decreed. First the Kohen, then the Levi, then the Israel. Erev Techumim, was created in order to bring peace and allow peaceful relations between neighbors. Addressing situations with the understanding that they, Chazal, could ameliorate those situations. So that rather than having disharmony, shalom, the lack of shalom in human relations, they would have shalom. They could create shalom. An interesting observation, as an aside, as I learned through those Mishnayot and those Brightot, it strikes me that Chazal did not attempt to legislate against what they believe to be human nature. Jealousy is natural. It comes to all of us. Envy comes to all of us. And rather than simply decreeing, it's asur to be jealous, it's asur to be envious, it's asur to allow your pride to get in the way of your relations with someone else, or to allow your economic interests to keep you from doing that which is right. Rather than saying we ignore human nature, the question that they asked and that they attempted to address was, how do we work within human nature so that we are able to guide individuals to overcome those weaknesses without believing that simply by ignoring them, harmony will prevail. And I think there's an important lesson there, even for modern legislation. There's a misunderstanding. I think that's very common, and certainly I hear it not necessarily with this group, but in conversations with friends, and when I've taught this material previously. The misunderstanding being that mipnei darchei shalom, and another concept that we'll be learning a little later on today, mipnei eva, in order to avoid halacha, that's created in order to avoid hostility, was directed specifically and perhaps in some misunderstanding exclusively, regulating relations between Jews and non-Jews. The idea being that Jews lived in a non-Jewish society. We really don't want to get along with them. We don't want to have to deal with them. But since we're there anyway, and we don't want them to be beating us up on us all the time, B'nei Dachai HaShalom will adopt certain practices. It's a misunderstanding which is not borne out certainly not by our review of the texts, and by an understanding of the text in general. In fact, the vast majority of those takanot, of that halacha created b'nei dachei shalom or mipnei eva, for the sake of creating harmony in society or to avoid hostility, don't deal with relations between Jews and non-Jews, but deal with relations within the Jewish community. The examples that we reviewed last week, I think, exemplify that, and we'll go a little further this week. And I would say, even as we're going to see in a few moments, when they address relations between Jews and non-Jews, the tone, at least in the Tannaitic period, was mostly not how do we avoid them from them wanting to beat us up on us, to, again, an extension of this notion of kol b'nei shalom, that the paths of Torah, the society that Torah seeks to create, are paths of harmony among all human beings. So, with that as an introduction, any questions? Let me leave room. Any questions or comments or observations? No, then let's go on. We ended last week with a look at a Mishnah that I think that talks about the vision of creating shalom, and perhaps the difficulties of creating shalom between Jews who are more observant and Jews who are less careful in their observance. Creates problems. We had a discussion after the class was over on a situation in which, what if you're walking down the road on Shabbos and somebody who you either know to be Jewish or believe to be Jewish, driving a car, stops to ask directions? What can you do? And one possibility that was raised was, well, you just keep on walking and ignoring them. Another possibility that was raised was, will, in order to avoid their sinning further, give them the directions so that way they'll drive less. Otherwise, they'll just ramble around and get lost. That's not good. Third possibility was, mipnei dachei shalom, since the Yisurim that we're referring to would be the Isur against your helping, if there were an Isur, would be a Durabanan, is mipnei dachei shalom. Give them the information that they're looking for so that at the very least they won't think badly of Frum Jews. They won't think that Frum Jews are just rude. We discussed all three of those possibilities, and I did promise to ask Rabbi Yasker, our local Mora D'Asra, how he would approach the question, and so I did. And I let me just report that he told me of he had the same conversation with one of his teachers, Nechama Leibowitz, with whom Rabbi Yasker was very close through the decades. The great teacher of Chumash and Farshim, and she told him the story that at early times her position had been simply to walk on, which she acknowledged was later on interpreted as being rude. Until she asked the question, or in her name had the question asked of Rav Auerbach, who was a great posek in Yerushalayim in the middle of the last and towards the end of the last century. And he answered that one should give that one should give the directions. Either mipnei dachei shalom, because in fact you really do want to create harmony. And as we've learned, that Isurim D'Rabbanan are the Chazal would not have applied those Isurim if they create in situations that create disharmony. Or at the very least, Mishum Eva, because you don't want this non-firm person driving away thinking, oh, all of these Jews are just terrible. And certainly, we want to limit the number of miles, the distance, the time that this person will spend driving. So we don't want them to get lost. Anyway, so that was Rabbi Yasker's halachic response. Now, let's look very quickly at the last Mishnah and see how that the last Mishnah that we looked at last week, and we'll see how that reinforces this notion of acts that we can do mipnei dachei shalom that we ordinarily wouldn't do in our relationship with Jews who are less religiously observant or less careful in their observance than we are. Let me just screen share here. Okay, so as we learned last week, the Mishnah is dealing with the question of we have two women, one who is careful in her observance of the Shavuot year, that is, she won't do anything with grain or other produce grown during the Shavuot year, who's approached by her friend who perhaps is suspected of being less observant in those matters, less careful in those matters. And her friend asks to borrow that equipment that's used for working with produce. If she's talking about working with grain bought in the grown in the sabbatical year, it would be forbidden for her to do that. And because it would be forbidden for her to work with that produce, it would be forbidden for someone to lend them the equipment to do it. Just as if I were approached on Shabbos morning by a friend of mine who drives on Shabbos, asking to borrow my car, Saturday morning I wouldn't lend them my car. I couldn't lend them my car. If they came to me Friday morning and said, Howie, can I borrow your car? My car's out for the weekend and I have to go grocery shopping this morning. And even though I know that there's a possibility that he might also use the car on Shabbos. I don't know that will be for sure. I would lend him my car. I may lend him my car. That is, I'd be permitted to b'nei dachei shalom. So too in this case, the Mishnah says that a woman who's approached by her friend who's not careful about the Shavuot year may lend all of this equipment, but can't can't actually do the acts with her. but you can lend it mipnei drachei shalom. And the Mefarshim explain that perhaps out of an abundance of caution, Chazal originally made asur lending material when you have a suspicion that it may be used in that way. You don't know that she's working with Shavuot produce. Maybe she's working with grains that were taken, that were grown before Shavuot. Hopefully, everybody has enough left over so that they won't starve on the Shavuot year itself. And maybe she is in fact careful about the halacha of Shavuot. You don't know. So, yes.
It's Jerry. In the example you cited before about your friend wanting to borrow your car on Friday, how about the issue of Maris Ayin?
You know, that is a great question. It's interesting that in these Mishnah, in the Mishnah and in the Mefarshim on the Mishnah, that question isn't raised at all. The question of Marit Ayin is largely, and I think in this sort of instance, entirely midrabanan. And so, how would we weigh the midrabanan isur of Marit Ayin? Marit Ayin being maybe somebody will see someone driving my car, think that it's me, or think that I've loaned the car knowing that it was specifically to be driven on Shabbat, and come through that to assume that it is permitted to drive on Shabbat. That's the issue of Marit Ayin, lest that happen. And how would we weigh that against Mipnei Dachei Shalom, lending the car not on Shabbos for Shabbos, though we'll see in a moment that may be possible. At least there's one day that allows for it. But my lending the car the day before, knowing that it's going to be used the day before, without saying, "Oh, but don't drive my car on Shabbat." It's a good question, Jerry. I would weigh B'nei Dachei Shalom over the issue of Marit Ayin. But again, I think that's a shaila that we'll need to ask our local posek. It's not raised by the Mefarshim on this Mishnah, or by the next Mishnah that we'll look at in a moment. But as I was saying, out of an abundance of caution, Chazal originally said, you know what? If there's even a suspicion of Shavuot, or that she's not careful in Shavuot, or that she was using a grain that was grown on Shavuot, you shouldn't lend it to her. Our Mishnah is coming now to address that and to say, but let's add a caveat. But if Mibnei Dachei HaShalom, if you're concerned that she'll that this would create disharmony between you, and you don't know for certain that she is in fact using your things against Shavuot, right? Then Mibnei Dachei HaShalom, you may lend it. The next Mishnah takes this a step further, and this is didn't look at last week. This is new material for us. This is taken from the Yerushalmi, and in fact, let me take it to the English. I don't have the English here. I'm sorry. Hamadir Chavero. If someone takes an oath, makes a neder concerning his friend, he would really like his friend to come spend a Shabbos meal with him. And he takes an oath, says, if my friend doesn't come, if Shmuley isn't coming next week to have meal with me, then I'm gonna jump off the roof. Right? Hamatir chavero sheyechel eitzlo. Somebody takes an oath, letting his friend Shmuley know about this oath, in order to convince Shmuley that he should eat with him, have a meal with him. Who eino amino al hamaisrot. The problem is that this guy who wants his friend Shmuley very badly to come share a meal with him, he's not believed when it comes to questions of Maasrot. he's not careful about it, and because he doesn't think it's important, maybe he'll tell a falsehood. Oh yeah, I took Meiser, don't worry about it. We don't know that he does that, but he's suspected. He just doesn't have credibility in the issues of dealing with Meiser. Ochel imo b'Shabbat harishona, afal pi she'eno ne'eman al Meiser. That in fact Shmuley can share the meal with him on the first Shabbat, and the Gemara goes on to explain what is the first Shabbat. Is referring to the first Shabbat after his wedding, or after the wedding of his children, right? Shabbos of Sheva Brachos. In some communities it's referred to as Shabbat Chatan. So on Shabbat Chatan, on the Shabbos of Sheva Brachos, Shmuley can come and eat with him, even though he's not generally believed regarding Ma'asrot, as long as he says Musarin Haim, that in fact Ma'asrot was taken. Generally, he has no credibility in these matters, but because he feels so strongly that Shmuley should join him for that Shabbat, and it's such a special Shabbat in his life, Shmuley may join him. The Gemara is going to say Mibnei Drachei Shalom or Mibnei Eva. Shabbat Shniyah, but on the second Shabbos, that means once Sheva Brachot is over, once Shabbat Chatan is history, Afal Pisha who no der mimenu, even though he took a similar oath, I'm going to jump off the roof if you don't come fully. Lo yechel ad she'aser. You can't eat with him until you know for certain that he has taken Maaser. And his simply saying that isn't enough. So the Gemara explains Rabbi Yanai, Rabbi Yishmael, B'Shem Rabbi Yochanan, that first B'Shabbat Shel it's an Aramaic word. I had to look it up. It means Sheva Brachos, the first Shabbos. Hitiru Mibnei Eva, because in order to at least avoid hostility between the host and Shmuley. Amar Rabbi Avon kan hitiru tveli mishum dachei shalom. Rabbi Avon. Now remember, this is recorded in the Yerushalmi, and so it's talking about the custom, the practice in Eretz Israel. Rabbi Avon says, you know what? Here in the home of Rabbi, in the place of Rabbi Yonah, we're matir even something which is suspected to be tevel. The Rabbanan Mefarshim explain not in the Dioraisa, Mipnei Dachei Shalom, in order for the ways of peace. And Jerry, again, to address your question, even though it's known that the host has no credibility when it comes to issues of Maaser, they don't seem to be concerned with Marasayim. And I think in general, the issue of Marasayim becomes more widespread in later days. Okay. So this, I think, really summarizes the understanding of how we relate to our non-from friends in ways to create dachei shalom, to assure that there's peace and harmony within the Jewish community, and at the very least to avoid hostility. And the common denominator, I think the intent is that yes, we can suspend or overlook certain issues that the Chazal made, certain isurim that the Chazal created out of an abundance of caution, if that is a real issue here. But what we cannot do, as we learned in the first Mishnah, is that we can't be over transgress the sin, mipnei dachei shalom, even with our non-from friends. And we really cannot do things which support them directly in their transgressing. If they're merely suspect, or the situation allows for the possibility that there's a halachic problem, perhaps we can overlook that with Mipnei Dachei Shalom. But if there's absolute knowledge that their intent is to be over an avera, especially a deoraita, then even Mipnei Dachei Shalom, we don't participate. We don't support. Let's go to the more even more difficult question of creating shalom with our non-Jewish neighbors. And the very first Mishnah that dealt with defining acts done with Mipnei Dachei Shalom, in fact, addressed this at the end of the Mishnah. We learned Mamachim biyad aniyei nachrim b'leket b'shich per Mipnei Dachei Shalom. We do not prevent aniyei nachrim, the poor among the non-Jews, poor who are not Jewish, to come to a field with along with the Jews who take leket shechacha upeya, who take the gleanings or sheaves that are forgotten behind, or the corners of the field, the pear that farmers are required to leave for the aniyim. Even though these aniyim are these mitzvot are intended for use by Jewish aniyim, non-Jews who come along are not stopped. That they're allowed to take them as well. In the Gemara brings a Braita, also of Tanaitic origin, from the same time period, that seems to have a slightly different take. Mefarnasim aniyei nachrim im aniyei Yisrael. We support, we sustain the poor who are non-Jews together with Aniyei Yisrael, the poor who are Jews. And furthermore, Muvakrim Chole Nachrim Im Chole Yisrael. We visit the non-Jews who are sick, just as we visit the Jews who are sick. And Kovrim Mate Nachrim Im Mate Yisrael. Just as we're going to make an effort to assure that Jewish bodies of Jews who have died are buried, so too we will make the same effort to assure that the bodies of non-Jews are buried. And of course, the Mefarshim explain that the Mishnah does not mean to say we bury them in the same plot. We bury them separately. Mipnei Dachei Shalom. Looking at the Mishnah and at the Gemara, it gives us a sense of what intended for Mipnei Dachei Shalom. But does anybody see a difference in the language, perhaps even in the intent of the two Mishnayot? With the Mishnah saying "Ein mamchin," we don't prevent them from doing this act, from joining Jews. The Gemara going a step further, it would seem, and saying "Mefarnasim." We actively sustain them. So others point this difference out and are perplexed by it. Is the Gemara, the Braita being quoted by the Gemara, going further than the Mishnah itself? And there are some among later commentaries and contemporaries who in fact say this shows that there was a machloket as to how far can we go in our relations with non-Jews. Is the intent of Chazal to actively encourage us to do that which is necessary to create Dachei Shalom with grace, to do it graciously, and with neighborly love? We actively sustain them. Or is the intent, as articulated in the Mishnah, more begrudging? What we do is really for Jews, but because we don't want them to beat up on us, we really don't want to create a situation of Ishalom or of Ava, of hostility. Begrudgingly, if they come along, we won't stop them. And there are those in the contemporary world today who will point to the Mishnah and say that's the true attitude that the rabbis of old had towards non-Jews. Some who make that claim will in fact use it to criticize Halacha and the rabbis of the Mishnaic period and all rabbis who've come since. Others will say, well, that's certainly defining the way I want to relate to the non-Jewish world.
Rabbi,
There's another. I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Yes.
We go to Tannersville every summer, and during the summer in upstate New York, and during the summer, all these Hasidim come up from Brooklyn and so forth. The head of our synagogue always sends out a letter about how to treat the non-Jewish neighbors, and because we're guests in their community. And I mean, what do you do? I find so many of these Hasidim that come into the Tannersville area in the summer, ignore the non-Jews, or they don't treat them right. So I guess I've never understood. There's a Mishnah saying you should treat them properly, yet I see it, there's they create anti-Semitism in the upstate New York in these communities because of the way they treat the non-Jews.
Yeah.
But our shul,
unfortunately, that's an accurate observation. I'm sure we've all made the same observation. Let me put off the thinking about why that's so until a little later on in the session when we begin to talk about the language used in later Mishnayot and among the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, Mipnei Eva, in order to avoid hostility. And there may be something historical there. In terms of approaching the halacha, I would argue that in fact the Rav of your shul, sending out that letter, is promoting the understanding of the Gemara and of this later brisa that we're going to learn in a moment, which in fact would seem to be encouraging the act of creation of harmonious relations, not because simply because we don't want them to beat us up, but because that's the purpose of Torah, right, to create darchei shalom. Without getting into why some Jews have developed a different approach.
Darchei shalom means what?
Darchei shalom means the paths towards harmony. Shalom being peace or harmony, and that they take from Mishlei, the pasuk in the book of Proverbs, referring to Torah. Darchecha darchei noam, all the paths of Torah are pleasant. Shalom, and its byways. It is intended as a way towards shalom, towards harmony among human beings. They take that as the prime intent of purpose of Torah, and in fact then apply it through halacha, darchei shalom. Those, and I think this is certainly your Rav, and through the ages, the majority of Rabbanim. Will explain the Mishnah. Say, wait, when the Mishnah says "Ein memachim biyad aniyei Torah," that you don't prevent them, that's referring specifically in a case in which the intent of what's being set aside, the leket, the shechacha, the gleanings that have fallen when a person is reaping their field, or things that are forgotten in the field. Or the payah, that the corners of the field that have been consciously, purposefully set aside, because the Torah tells us to do that. That all of that, those narrow acts, are intended specifically for our Jews who live with us in Eretz Israel. And what the Mishnah is saying is that even in that case, if non-Jews come to share in it, we certainly don't stop them. In other cases, where in fact acts of chesed, which are mandated as understood as being part of the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the Torah's dictum in Vayikra, you shall act lovingly towards your fellow as towards yourself. That's understood as proactively including Jews and non-Jews, frum and non-frum. And that is the object of the that we sustain poor people who are not Jewish, just as we sustain poor people who are Jewish, because all of that falls under the rubric v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall act lovingly towards your fellow as towards yourself.
I
Yeah.
just want to add something to what this gentleman had said. If we put it a little bit more home to where we are now, and with the virus that we're in, I know a lot of people don't want to get involved in this, but like how we are viewed versus the Goyim in different very religious areas, such as Borough Park, Muncie, Flatbush, or whatever, in terms of the Jews not wanting to wear masks when, even up to now. And of course, when people were dying and they were holding, what do you call this? When people died, they had, them in millions of these Hasidim, thousands of them rather, coming out in the street, coming together. And how do you think the Goyim view this? They don't really care about us as Goyim, which even if they even if they feel that they don't want to wear a mask, but how does the world view them by not, they don't care about us. They only care about their own people. So that's they create a lot of anti-Semitism in their actions and the things that they do. Everybody they don't even care about their own Jews. I mean, let alone about what, and the Goyim ends up hating the Jews even more for no reason. If they only thought about, how does the world view us? Okay, even if I may not really agree with it, you know what? I'll go out to Darkei Shalom and I'll put on my mask so that they feel that, we're not above them, or we're, whatever. But
belatedly, excuse me, let me interrupt because I can have to move on. But okay. You're right, and belatedly, the rabbinic leadership within much of that community, certainly in Borough Park and in much of the yeshivish world, has recognized that and begun saying, Mishum Eva, in order to avoid the hostility that's being created, we have to act as if we believe in masks, etc., etc. We don't need to go into the psychology and perhaps the sort of emunah that goes into believing that they, for themselves, they don't need to have masks. They don't need to take acts with science as saying keeps you safer. We don't have to go into that. I think I do understand it, but Eva, Mishum Eva, none of that would matter. And I think that's an excellent point that you're making. And in fact, let's take a look at again the Yerushalmi, which seems to take this even further, right? That is, how far do we go to create a harmonious, perhaps integrated relationship between Jews and non-Jews in society? Tani,
I think it's important that we know that that we should not be making a Chilul Hashem. And right. I don't think that the really from Hasidic Jews even think of it that way. If they did, they don't think, how does the world view us? And so how important it is to make a Kiddush Hashem, but also not to make a Chilul Hashem. So, I don't think it even enters their mind, we're not making a Chilul Hashem. We're doing what we think is right.
Right. I'm going to I'm uncomfortable. I become uncomfortable when our conversation turns towards criticizing another Jewish community, even though I think your point is correct. Our focus needs to be, I would argue, our focus needs to be on how do we understand the halacha and how do we use it to guide our relationships, perhaps in appropriate ways, giving tochacha, giving admonishment to those who might be acting differently when we believe such, and doing it in ways when such admonishment will be effective. I don't want to speak of them, those Jews. Let's just speak about us, and what we learned from our Torah. And
Okay.
the Yerushalmi goes even further. And I just put the English on the page so you can read along. Tani, Ir sheyesh bo goyim b'Yisrael ma'amidim, a city which includes both Jews and non-Jews living together. And what's interesting is that the Mefarshim on the Yerushalmi say, they're talking about Caesarea. Caesarea, a city which in the Tannaitic period had Jews and non-Jews, and in fact, many of the Jews were Hellenized already. They were assimilated, acculturated, I guess is a better word. But there was also a strong rabbinic community in Caesarea. They might very well have been speaking about Tzipori, which was a similar situation. Tzipori was where the Beit Din, where Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who compiled the Mishnah and his whole school, was situated. There you had secularized Jews, Hellenized non-Jews, and yeshiva, rabbinic observant Jews living together in relative harmony, it seems. So in such a city, ma'amidim gabe goyim, not only do we include non-Jews as recipients of our tzedakah, we go further. We appoint non-Jews to be gabayim, to be responsible for collecting and distributing tzedakah. We include them in the whole in the whole system. And then of course we include the non-Jews in all of the acts of chesed that we're doing among those who are Jews. I mean, the Yerushalmi goes into interesting details. We even wash their clothes, just as we'll wash the clothes of Jews so that they can maintain their dignity. Okay. The next paragraph, some Gerdai, some clod, a jerk, a Jewish jerk, I might add, asks Rav Imi, well, what about the non-Jews' festive day? Shouldn't we be celebrating Christmas? As comparison, Mipnei Darchei Shalom, right? So Rav Abba says, so this is Rav Abba said that Rav Chia taught the festive days of non-Jews are forbidden for Jews. Absolutely not. You know, we're going to take Darchei Shalom to create a harmonious society between Jews and non-Jews up to a point, but not beyond that point. And Rav Imi's concluding statement, I think, is telling. Rav Imi said, if not for Rav Abba, we would already be approaching the point of permitting their idolatry. Bless God who distinguished us from them. As I read Rav Imi, what I see is that in fact tension within the rabbinic community, within the observant Jewish community, over exactly how far might we take this, and what do we need to be concerned about the slippery slope. That in fact, if we get too friendly, if we're too inclusive of non-Jews and the non-Jewish leadership in our societal institutions, that might lead us to raising Jews like this jerk, who says, well, it's time to start keeping Christmas also. After all, it's not idol worship. It's not really asur. And let's be part of their society completely, not only including them in ours. And Rav Imi is representing those within the rabbinic community who are saying, wait, we have to be really cautious. And thank God for Rav Abba, who is going to protect us and continue to distinguish us from them as God intended. Yes, Ivan.
Yeah. What about like yeshiva holding classes on, let's give two examples, Thanksgiving and or Christmas. And we're talking about a place where the secular teachers may not be Jewish.
Right. So for instance, the yeshiva that I attended through high school, we had shir both on Thanksgiving and certainly on Christmas. Did not have secular studies because many of the teachers of secular studies were not Jewish. But I think that's a great example of where at least the administrators of the yeshiva that I attended, and following, I think, guidance from many others, where they chose to draw the line, keeping in mind both the teachings of this Brisa in the Yerushalmi and the concerns of Rabbi, that in fact a balance is needed. And the line where you're going to draw the balance is entirely subjective. I always felt that there should be, we in the Jewish community, perhaps we need to make a difference between Thanksgiving and Christmas. That perhaps Thanksgiving is more consistent with Jewish tradition than that certainly Christmas is not. But I really understand the other view that says, wait, that's nice, but we have our own forms of Thanksgiving. And once we start accepting Thanksgiving, then Halloween is around the corner, and after Halloween comes Christmas. So, but I think here what we're seeing, without giving a dictate on how to answer it, the fact that Rav Imi is added to this brisa that the Yerushalmi brings does point out that it's recognized that there's a tension between the goal of creating darchei shalom, even integrating non-Jews into the secular institutions within a Jewish community, the charitable institutions, on the one hand, and on the other hand, making sure that we still have boundaries so that we won't go beyond those boundaries. Today we're celebrating Christmas. Tomorrow we're simply saying, well, isn't it wonderful that they worship their gods? Let me add, by the way, that the question might not apply as strongly to contemporary period, that they really are, this is all being discussed in an era in which Ovdei Avodah Zarah, the non-Jews, with the exception of a small band of Christians, possibly in that era. But when they talked about non-Jews, they really talked about idol worshippers, which is a clear dioraita. There are many who are of the opinion that modern Christianity, while it's certainly asur for Jews, it's not idolatry. And it's probably not even asur for those who weren't born Jewish. But so we have to keep that in mind. I think when we certainly want to discuss secular holidays like Thanksgiving and perhaps even Christmas. Any other questions?
How should we relate to the Jews who celebrate both holidays in their homes and have a Christmas tree?
And that's, some of us will look at that and say, well, that may be extending into the concerns that Rav Imi is articulating, even though it's not idolatry. It's maybe taking us a little too close to blending us and them. Bless God who distinguished us from them. So I understand it, but and because of that, perhaps we aren't judgmental, but we might draw the line. I think certainly many of us would draw the line a little closer to home. Other questions? So last 10 minutes, my timing has been off today. The last category is the category of halacha created no longer using the language of mipnei darchei shalom in order to create a harmonious society, the paths towards a harmonious society, but mipnei eva, in order to avoid hostility. And this is where sometimes there are some within the Orthodox community who believe that there's no hope of darchei shalom between Jews and non-Jews. That in fact, all we can hope for is avoiding hostility. And so it's best when we can to simply ignore them. And when we can't, then begrudgingly we'll do something to avoid Avon. Okay, begrudgingly, we'll wear masks, we'll say hello to them on the street, if we have to. And that's in the creation of the use of Mipnei Ava. My observation, and I'll make it early rather than after we go through all the texts, which I think will prove this, is that in fact, the change is a historical change. The change in language between explaining halacha mipnei darchei shalom and later explaining it mipnei eva in order to simply to avoid hostility. That as our experience within society became more and more hostile, both in our relationships with non-Jews and in the relationships that observant Jews who cared for Torah and halacha, which became a smaller and smaller minority among the Jewish population, even in Eretz Israel and certainly in Galus. As though those relations became harsh and the experience became more difficult, perhaps the vision of what was possible became narrower, became blacker, so that no longer dreamed of a harmonious society, but at the very least avoiding hostility. Just as with Mipnei Darchei Shalom, Halacha created in order to bring about harmonious relations, focused much more on relations within the Jewish community than on relations between Jews and non-Jews. So too Halacha, that's ascribed to avoiding hostility, Mishum Eva, also focused far more on internal Jewish relations than on relations between Jews and non-Jews. And the instances that we bring, I think, bear that out. So, for instance, a large group of these halachot deal with the relationship between a husband and wife at times of tension. So, for instance, the first Mishnah that we have down here, the Gemara Rav Huna said to Rav, that Rav said, a woman might say to her husband, I will not be sustained by you, and in turn, you don't get to keep what I earn. The Chazal made two levels of takanot regarding the financial relationship within a marriage. The first takana was that a husband is obligated to provide sustenance for his wife, to give her food, to give her clothing, to give her housing, because in those days, frequently a woman didn't have the means to sustain herself. And so Chazal created the halacha saying, you know, you want the privileges of being married, mister? Then you have to make sure that she's taken care of financially. Then Mishum Eva, in order to avoid the husband resenting a wife who is working or who can sustain herself, saying, "Hey, I'm paying all this money for her clothes, for her food, for her housing, and yet she keeps everything she earns." In order to avoid that as a source of hostility, Chazal later made a second takana, saying that the husband gets to keep that which the wife earns or which the wife finds. Similarly, there's another Mishnah which will apply the same understanding to a man's children. He sustains them, he gets to keep their earnings and whatever they find, at least while they're still minors. So the Gemara is addressing that situation and fine-tuning it and saying, okay, since this halacha was created, mishum, in order to avoid hostility, a husband resents the financial success of his wife because he's sustaining her. So a woman has the right to say, you know what, Bubby, you don't have to sustain me anymore. I'll buy my own clothes. I'll pay half the mortgage. I'll buy my own food, and I get to keep what I earn. That is permitted, because then there's no longer the concern for Ava. And this leads to a whole series of halachot. For instance, if a woman is in a situation of divorce but not yet divorced, that is, he gave a get, she received a get, but he challenges it, says, you know what, I never gave it, or I didn't intend it, or this or that. Divorced but not yet divorced, almost like an aguna. She no longer has to share what she finds with him, and she gets to keep her earnings, either because, you know what, the Ava is already there. There's already a hostile relationship. So there's, by letting her keep what she's earning or what she finds, isn't going to avoid it any longer. Or because the rabbis wanted to apply some pressure for the husband to give the divorce already. You know, it's gone this far, let's just get it over with, and certainly wanted to avoid a disincentive. And so she gets to keep what she keeps. Or the Gemara in Yevamot discussing a case in which a woman marries after her husband is lost at sea. She gets married. She gets remarried, and then her husband reappears. Not an unthinkable, horrible, but not an unthinkable occurrence. So the rule is, first, she has to divorce both men. And second, even before the divorces are finalized, she gets to keep her earnings. She has no obligations to either men. Mishum, anything which was created Mishum Ava doesn't exist, because the Ava is going to exist between the two men, not between either of the men and the women, once this is the halachic requirement. I see time has gotten late. Bringing this back to our relationship between Jews and non-Jews, there's a story told in the Gemara, which is now going to address the whole question of why do some Jewish communities, somebody spoke of Borough Park, but in some Hasidic communities, or perhaps even in some non-Hasidic but yeshivish communities, the attitude towards relationships with non-Jews seems to be based more on hostility and begrudgingly doing what the halacha requires to avoid hostility. And I suggested earlier that this might come from historical experience. The observation being that the communities that tend to take that approach are communities which in many other ways are still based historic in the historic reality, which in fact was our experience in Europe and elsewhere for almost 2,000 years. That the experience from the non-Jewish community towards us was so hostile that it created attitudes within us that have been very, very difficult to break. And I think this is borne out. Unfortunately, I don't have the text, so you'll have to trust me as I read it. In the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where the Mishnah teaches that a daughter of Israel, a Jewish woman, should not serve as a midwife to an idolater, to a woman who does idolatry and who's giving birth, because she is aiding the birthing of more idolaters. That's what the Mishnah says. But it goes on to say, but you can allow a woman who does idolatry to serve as a midwife for a Jewish woman. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara brings a Breita, which says, in the name of Rabbi Meir, that a non-Jew that you shouldn't allow a non-Jewish woman, an idolatrous I mean, I think there's a distinction there. An idolatrous woman to serve as a midwife for Jews because they don't take Jewish life seriously and might very well in a secret way kill the Jewish child and the Jewish infant as it's being. And then it goes on, the Gemara goes on, brings a story, which talks about a conversation among non-Jewish midwives, non-Jewish midwives, in which one woman turns to another, one non-Jewish woman turns to another and says, you're a midwife to these Jews, meaning to insult her. And the woman, not wanting to be insulted, comes back and says, well, but I do that because I kill their children. And in fact, and goes on to describe an instance in which she had killed a Jewish. Rabbi Meir takes that, the Gemara says that Rabbi Meir hears that literally and says, you know what, this is proof. We all know that they hate us. We all know that they wish us dead. And here we have someone admitting to that. That becomes for Rabbi Meir and others who followed him the basis for, let's avoid hostility to the degree that we can, but it's a mistake to ever try to create Darchei Shalom. The Chachamim, according to the Gemara, say, you know what, never happened. Yes, that conversation took place, but the woman really didn't mean it. She's to be understood as bragging, as making up a story in order to protect her position among her non-Jewish friends. But in fact, even idolaters respect life, and we don't have to be concerned for that. And that becomes the basis for those who, even though we've experienced 2,000 years of hostility, sometimes murderous hostility, from non-Jews, who will still say our goal as we build relations in the non-Jewish world is to create Darchei Shalom, not only to keep us from beating them, to keep them from beating us up. Certainly, as we've had a new experience, perhaps in some parts of the non-Jewish world, and I would argue absolutely here in America. And we've, while keeping our guard up, while watching out for the hate that really does exist out there, but with all of that, we do what we can to build Darchei Shalom among all Jews and between Jews and within the non-Jewish community. We're ready to depart from our historical experience. Those whose lives are still very much based in the historical experience in Europe or before have more difficulty doing that. Look, let us hope that our actions and our pursuit of shalom in all of our endeavors paves the road not only for Darchei Shalom, but for Biat HaMashiach and for Geula as quickly as possible. Because that, I think those of us who are on this call would agree, is really what we're all about. So
Yeah, I have a question for you on Darchei Shalom. All right. One of the situations we face in America today, some of us may have very close non-Jewish neighbors. How do you handle the situation of a wake and a funeral of a non-Jew in terms of keeping with Darchei Shalom?
That's a great question, and I think that depends on the nature of the wake and the funeral. That is, if we're dealing with a Catholic, a traditional Catholic funeral, or even more so, an Orthodox Christian funeral, in which religious observance is taking place, which would be asur for us. So, for instance, I'm dropping the word now. when they drink the wine and take the wafer, that's called taking communion. Taking communion. When that's a part, and that's often part of a religious Catholic funeral, and parallels to that in the Orthodox Christian world. So that has to become of more concern for us, because that is it tastes of avodah zarah, even if halachically it's not quite avodah zarah. If we're talking about a more secular, experience, then it's really not a problem for us at all. So, depending upon the nature of the funeral, the nature of the wake, when it's a secular experience, I would argue with certain relationships, it's entirely appropriate for us for a Jew to attend. I don't want to say participate, but to attend passively. And sometimes in some situations, if we're dealing with someone who truly is in their life has acted as a righteous person, or who has done wonderful things for us, if only mishum hakaras hatov, recognizing the good that others have done for us, even after their life, then we should be attending, but not participating. So, for instance, in a few instances that I've felt compelled to go to such a place, I would make a point of not being inside a church while the religious service is going on. Certainly, if others are kneeling, I would not kneel. When others go up to accept communion, I step outside. When we're dealing with a secular service, then that doesn't become an issue at all. And as I said, I would argue not only b'nei drachei shalom, but also because of hakaras hatov and act, recognizing the goodness in this particular person who's neftar. It's fine to go. There are no easy answers, so it's all a question of balancing Rabbi's concerns, which are real concerns, with drachei shalom and the other.
Let me find out. Okay, so what about if you go to a Protestant church, not a Catholic church? Let's say they're Protestant. Are you then allowed to be inside a Protestant church while this service is going on?
Well, the question becomes, one of the questions is there an issue of avodah zarah? Is that form of Christianity avodah zarah or not? If it is considered avodah zarah, then absolutely under no circumstances,
right,
the makom of avodah zarah, you can't go in. If it's not, then I think this brings up an issue that Jerry raised earlier, the issue of, I think it was Jerry, the issue of Morris Ayin. Are we going to be concerned that people will see me going into this Protestant church during when something official is being held, and take from that it's mutar to participate in non-Jewish or in Christian worship as they do it in that church? That would be an issue of Morris Ayin.
Rabbi.
And I would argue, and I believe that if there are other reasons to be there, a funeral for someone who was a neighbor, or a funeral for someone who was righteous in the way they acted towards the Jewish community in public ways, and therefore mishum hakaras hatov really deserve us to attend, then Morris Ayin becomes less of an issue. That people who know me and who know the situation will understand that I'm there not because I think it's fine to participate in this Protestant service, but specifically to be machabed, to pay honor to this particular individual.
In Kew Garden Hills, we had that issue about Morris Ayin. It was a McDonald's around the corner from our house.
Kew Garden Hills?
Kew Garden Hills.
Yeah, I came from Kew Garden Hills. That's why.
Well, I used to live in Palmanock Crest Apartments, and around the corner was whatever, was a McDonald's, and it had a big playground. And on Shabbos afternoon, a lot of us would go take our kids to the playground. And people would think, oh, you're going to McDonald's on Shabbos, or you're going to McDonald's altogether, not realizing that, you're just going to the playground. And the question of Morris Iron came up a lot in our community when I lived there.
Yeah, I think and that's where it's helpful to ask either for psak halacha or at least for guidance from individuals who know the community, who know your situation, and who know the halacha, and to talk it through with someone who has all three of those qualities.
Rabbi Schoenfeld said it was fine.
Or they don't know the community, and certainly they don't. If they don't know the halacha, then I'm not sure that I would encourage speaking with them. But if they have all three, if they live in Lakewood and don't know the situation that you face in Kew Garden Hills, I'm not sure that they can be much help. But okay. It's getting late. I at 11:30 I have a grandson that I learn with for 3 days a
Good.
week.
I want to thank Rabbi Alpert and thank all of you for your participation. This is the last in the series of Rabbis on Rotation. Monday mornings have been since beginning of the season. However, I will tell you that we will have a special pre-Pesach series of shiurim. Look for those in the synagogue bulletin, so that hopefully you'll feel that you'll be able to continue to learn with rabbis from our Century Village, from our Torah or community. So again, thank you, Rabbi Alpert, and thank you all for your participation.
End meeting or leave meeting.
I just wanted to say to Rabbi Alpert that he was super. I really enjoyed